Hundreds of years before Jesus was born, when the Old Testament was still under construction in a fairly primitive and tenuous Palestinian culture, the Greeks were reaching a zenith of art and literature and philosophy. In the 4th century before the Common Era, Plato wrote the first really outstanding classic works of Western philosophy. His life's work makes an impressive collection of dialogues, and unlike most of the philosophy assignments that I had to read in college, Plato did us the favor of writing his material in the form of conversations. It's almost like a play. They read something like if you were reading a script for a play in which the different characters carry different roles in unfolding Plato's thoughts. His beloved teacher, Socrates, is the character who gets all the good lines and all the good ideas. So you know if the line is being delivered by Socrates, it's something that Plato takes seriously. You sometimes have to pay attention to the setting of the conversation, whether it's at day or night, and whether they're inside the city of Athens. Plato tended to think that all great thoughts originated inside of Athens. So if they were walking while they were talking and they walked outside the city walls, he's letting you know maybe this argument isn't all that good, maybe less informed or less insightful. But you especially have to pay attention when he gives lines to someone that we know that Plato despised. And to the best of my knowledge, there's no one that he despised more than the Greek playwright Aristophanes. Aristophanes had libeled Socrates in his plays, perhaps leading to the generally dismissive view that his fellow Athenians had of him that made it possible for the city government to condemn him to death. I don't want to do any armchair psychology across the distance of 2,300 years, but I find it to be curious that the only time that Plato brought up the subject of love relationships, that he gives all the lines to the hated Aristophanes. So it's hard to tell how serious Plato wants to take the recounted myth that Aristophanes describes in the Symposium, but at the very least, it's reflective of an ancient understanding of why people seem so doggone determined to sacrifice their freedom, their independence, and often their happiness in order to be married to somebody else. The myth that Aristophanes retells is basically this. Originally, all human beings had 2 heads, 4 arms, and 4 legs, and 2 sets of genitalia. There were 3 different kinds of people. Some had 2 sets of female genitals, some had 2 sets of male genitals, and some had 1 set of male genitals and 1 set of female genitals. And that paragraph that I just delivered actually more than doubles the total number of times that I have said genitalia in the pulpit in my 30 years of preaching. Because some of these 2-headed, 4-armed, 4-legged humans were becoming too aggressive with the gods, Zeus decided, I'll just split them in 2. And if that doesn't work, I'll split them into 4. But he split them into 2, making them much weaker, much less of a threat. And the end result of this tragic separation is that all humans spend the rest of their lives seeking for their other half. Now, I would ask you to note in this ancient myth, if you just do the math on this one evenly, there are more men looking for a male partner and more women looking for a female partner than there are men and women looking for partners of the opposite sex. I don't know if that says something about ancient Greece or about Aristophanes or Plato or about all of us, but no matter how you divide up the math, the myth is intended to state that no single individual is ever whole without his or her other half. Now, I hope that we here have long ago dispensed with any sense that just because something is ancient, that is somehow magically superior and more insightful than modern thinking. Most of the time, that is not only not true, it's the opposite of the truth. However, this bit of philosophical whimsy from Plato's pen can tell us 2 things. not the least of which is that same-sex relationships are perfectly normal, and they always have been from the dawning of human civilization. A fact which is especially interesting to talk about in this particular year, because after an entire lifetime of fighting for gay and lesbian rights, we finally got legal same-sex marriage in this year in the United States, including Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, and even though my home state was a bit of a jerk about it, even in Kentucky, you can have same-sex marriages now. And that only happened about 6 months ago, and we never even talk about it anymore. We talked about it all the time for 25 years, for 30 years, and now we don't even mention it because it's so normal. It was always normal, but it was a political thing we fought about. And once we finally got over the hurdle, it doesn't even rise to be mentioned. We almost forgot to be happy. Take a minute. Congratulate yourselves for being advocates for gay rights that we finally got there. The other thing we see in this myth is that there is a long-standing awareness that somehow human beings are drawn to live in marital unions. For most of human history, this has been a matter of economic survival. When most of humanity was dependent upon agriculture, it took a partnership with children spread out over decades to have adequate labor and mutual support to make society work. Civilization became deeply entrenched in gender-specific roles around labor, childbearing and child care, education, and even retirement. 150 years of my patriarchal family existed almost every day of their lives on a farm in Kentucky where the house was down near the spring. At the top of the hill was the graveyard, and on the other side of the hill was their church. And there were members of my family that lived in that tight little circle between the barn, the house, the church, and finally the graveyard for their entire history. Most of the world worked basically that way for a long, long time. But now, we are not tethered to a particular parcel of land. Having children not only does not enhance our economic stability, but in fact, the only people who ever seem to have any money are the ones that didn't have kids. In the past half century, we have seen that women don't necessarily need a man to support them or to help them raise children. Single mothers raised our current president and our previous Democratic president. It can not only be done, but it can be done fairly well. I had primary care of my daughter for her entire life, especially after she was 5 years old, and I have to tell you that she is damn near perfect. I was told when we applied for her American citizenship that she could never be president because she wasn't born in the USA, but that hasn't stopped Ted Cruz from running, so I'm not even sure about that anymore. But anyway, clearly, men can get along quite handsomely without a female partner as well. We can raise kids, we can support ourselves, regardless of how people have tried to malign my gender. We can be nurturing, we can even learn how to do long black hair. We don't have to have a spouse now to run a farm, or even to have or raise children. And though this may be a more delicate topic to treat in this context, we don't even have to have a spouse to have a sex life. The notion that there is some deity in the clouds that is obsessed with what you do with your private parts, I hope has become ridiculous in our minds. Statistics still indicate that married people have more frequent sex than single people do, in spite of the myths that exist on both sides of that matrimonial fence. But even among fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Muslims, the rate of sexually transmitted diseases is the same as it is among non-believers. So while there's a whole lot of deception and outright lying going on, pretty much everyone is involved in the whole game of sexuality one way or another. It is a recent development in terms of the history of civilization, but it is a pronounced change. We no longer need to be married for economic reasons, for sexual reasons, or even for procreation or adoption. So why do people continue to seek their other half? The poet and novelist Erica Jong said it very simply. Do you want me to tell you something really subversive? Love is everything it's cracked up to be. It's really worth fighting for, being brave for, risking everything for. Now, Erica's been married 4 times, and she has written novels about her first 3 husbands. So I bet this number 4 is going to hang in there till the end, because you really don't want to read about your marriage in a book. But a relationship doesn't have to last forever to be successful. Success isn't defined necessarily by longevity. Success is not always permanent. When marriage also included the powerful concerns of economic survival, agricultural food security, safety of a family, and mutual support in old age, people probably just adjusted their expectations about emotional fulfillment and made it work. You cannot escape the fact that religious norms evolved to lock people into stable marriages for the benefit of society, because it certainly wasn't for the benefit of making 2 unhappy people stay together. Now, coupling is a rather more exacting proposal in the 21st century. People do not financially, survival-wise, healthcare-wise, retirement-wise, need another person. But if I could take Aristophanes serious for just a moment, Zeus still dealt us a powerful wound, and there is still a need to find the other half. But now it's about love, and love alone. It's about meaning, companionship, shared values, mutual emotional support, more than it is about getting the laundry done or the crops harvested or getting the kids raised. Now, I've taken today to be publicly philosophical on a topic about which I am much more a perpetual spectator than I am a participant. But love in the 21st century still seems to be a topic that demands thoughtful analysis. Talking about this sort of topic is kind of like the TV commercials that we're going to be bombarded with now, trying to sell perfume and cologne. As we get close to Christmas, and cologne, perfumes are popular gifts, but all of the men's and women's fragrance companies are advertising their wares heavily, but you'll notice that not one single one of their commercials uses any adjective that has anything to do with their product. They don't talk about how their product has a spicy smell or a flowery smell or a sweet smell. They don't talk about how long the fragrance would last or how popular it is. All they have to sell is a fragrance, but they never talk about it. What they're trying to project is masculinity to men, femininity to women, sexual desirability to both, and those are things you cannot get from a bottle of fragrance. But that is the only way they try to sell it to you. We talk about sex. On our better days, we talk about friendship, companionship, but what we want out of that other half defies description with any bag full of adjectives. We want how love makes us feel. But our language ends up talking about things that are oftentimes much less than that feeling. Søren Kierkegaard, who I think may have been the smartest man to ever live, and at least in modern times, never married. He was in love, however. He was engaged for a time, but he didn't believe that he could make Regine Olsen, his betrothed. He didn't believe that he could make her happy, so he broke off the engagement. And I think it's safe to say from his books, Either Or, Repetition, and from his journal, that he never got tired of beating himself up about that decision. He made the entry in his journal that you heard Dan read a few moments ago, that standalone sentence, completely out of context from anything else in his journal. To live without love is a mistake for which there is no reparation, either in this life or in the life to come. For all the riches of intellect, the satisfaction of his very meaningful life as an author, he knew that there was a void that so eluded him that he never found it. And I might add my own belief that want of it is a great deal of what caused him to die so very young. That people ask, what did Kierkegaard die of? And a lot of times I'll just say depression. He was only 42. And I truly think it was a broken heart that led to his overall decline of health, that led to his early death. Now, I've been single most of my adult life, and I can say, in spite of the occasional solitude and inconvenience of being single, that it is a heck of a lot better than being with the wrong person. Still, like everyone else who has ever lived alone for a long time, you always existentially know that there is still a void that wants to be filled. Those of us who are single often do pity many of the married people we know who seem to be trapped, stuck in an unhappy union. And many married people look at those of us who are single as if we are all projects that need to be fixed. There is nothing wrong with spending your entire life as a single person, but I suspect that there has never been anyone who did that who would not gladly have traded their solo act for a meaningful partnership had the opportunity ever presented itself. I think that many of us who have tried and failed to find the right person may suffer from excesses of perfectionism. That is, in our minds we build up what it should be, and no real living mortal ever measures up. Many of what we would call successful marriages have survived through the years for no reason other than their obstinacy, that they just refused to give up. You look at some of the most wealthy, beautiful, and successful couples in the world, and you find that no one says that their marriage is easy. The famous actor Will Smith recently said about his 20-year-long marriage to actress Jada Smith, he said, "It's like our marriage was the most difficult, grueling, excruciating thing that we've ever taken on in our lives, but we're just not quitters." Now, that may not sound like much of a recommendation, and yet many of us would look from the outside and think, I'd like to be a part of that relationship. You think about that, looks like it's ideal, but even for them, they recognize that staying together is the hardest thing they've ever had to do. I know that he didn't say that it was an indictment. He didn't say that to be an indictment of those of us who've given up on past relationships, though there is a none too subtle reality to it. It's like this. As the novelist Ursula Le Guin said, love doesn't just sit there like a stone. It has to be made like bread, remade all the time. It has to be made new. That is, you don't find love. In our language, we talk about looking for it, but you don't just find it extant, and now, here, I've got it. We look for it. We look for the perfect partner or the right partner, our other half, but any successful relationship is made, and then it is remade, and then it is literally renegotiated to give it new life and new purpose. My marriage and family counseling professor told us 30 years ago that marriages had to be totally recreated about every 7 years, or it will die from staleness and irrelevance. I'm afraid that even that advice in and of itself may have become stale and irrelevant because the world is changing so much faster now than it was 30 years ago. I suspect that relationships probably need to remain rather dynamic, constantly changing, being renegotiated, fed, renewed, and like bread that will mold and go stale pretty quickly, it has to be remade over and over to keep it meaningful. Now, I'm going to have to stop these musings at some point, so I'm going to try to conclude with this. Marriage is no longer a necessary institution in our time. It's not economically, agriculturally, or even procreatively vital, and yet it remains mysteriously desirable as an existential partnership in the face of the inky blackness and isolation of the universe. Being married doesn't make you happy unless you put happiness into it. Being married doesn't give life meaning unless you continually bring meaning to it. And being married shouldn't be a lifetime bondage unless both parties remain stubbornly willing to make it more than an economic roommate sort of dependence. Whatever the mysterious core of true love is, that part that defies adjectives, religion, contracts, or rules, it is not something you will ever just discover. It's something you make. And so, in a word, I am encouraging you to make love. And I hope you don't even try to misinterpret that.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.